The alarm did not sound like a warning. It sounded like the end of something. Ethan Brooks felt the floor of the observation deck tremble under his boots before he understood why. Every screen around him turned the same shade of red at the same second, and a voice that was not human filled the room in a language that translated itself directly into his mind. Earth belongs to the Galactic Council. He froze. Around him, engineers dropped their tablets. Someone's coffee cup shattered on the floor, and nobody moved to clean it up. Outside the reinforced window, a shape unfolded against the black of space, larger than any structure humanity had ever built, older than anything humanity had ever seen. It did not fire a single shot. It did not need to. Ethan had spent 6 years working as a junior liaison for the International Space Council, translating half-understood alien signals into reports nobody above him ever read. Today, for reasons he did not yet understand, he was the only translator on duty when first contact turned into something far worse than contact. The ship above Earth called itself an adjudicator, its message repeated on every frequency, in every language, at the same volume, over and over. Earth and all its resources were now the lawful property of the Galactic Council, under a treaty signed before the pyramids were built, before language existed, before humans stood upright. Nobody on the planet had signed anything. Nobody on the planet had been asked. Within an hour, the president was on a secure line with people who did not have the authority to promise anything and knew it. Within 3 hours, every government on Earth had received the identical message, translated into every tongue spoken by every nation, delivered with a calm that felt more frightening than any threat could have. Ethan sat in a windowless room with 4 other officials, watching a live feed of the adjudicator ship as it extended smaller vessels from its hull, like seeds falling from a dead flower. He noticed something the others missed, something buried in the tone of the alien voice. It was not proud. It was not victorious. Under the practiced calm of galactic law, there was something that sounded almost like worry. He mentioned it to his supervisor, a tired woman named Grace Miller, who had not slept in 2 days. "They don't sound like conquerors," Ethan said. "They sound like people trying to finish a job before something catches up to them." Grace looked at him like he was inventing comfort out of nothing. "They own the planet now, Ethan, according to them. That's all that matters today." But Ethan could not let go of the feeling. He had listened to hundreds of hours of alien transmissions in training. Conquerors bragged. Conquerors threatened. This voice recited law, the way a person recites law when they are afraid a court might disagree with them. By nightfall, the Council's terms were clear. Humanity would submit to Council administration, hand over unrestricted access to its planet's resources, and accept a Council governor to oversee the transition. Refusal would result in Earth being reclassified as an unclaimed resource, which, according to the small print buried in the treaty broadcast, meant humanity itself would be considered part of the inventory. There was no vote. There was no debate that mattered. There was no fleet capable of resisting a ship that could flatten a continent from orbit without breaking a sweat. Within 2 days, the first Council shuttles descended over major cities, not with violence, but with paperwork, scanners, and officials who spoke about Earth the way a person speaks about a storage unit they have just unlocked after years of unpaid rent. Ethan was assigned, almost by accident, to the liaison team stationed at the new Council administrative post outside what used to be a quiet coastal city. His job was simple on paper: translate, document, and stay silent unless spoken to. In practice, it meant standing in rooms where the future of his species was being casually rearranged by beings who barely looked at him. The council administrator overseeing his sector was called Vesic, a tall figure whose skin shimmered faintly like oil on water, whose voice carried the same practiced calm as the first broadcast. Vesic did not seem cruel. Vesic seemed bored, the way an accountant looks bored auditing a company they already know is bankrupt. "You will find," Vesic said to Ethan on the first day, without looking up from a floating screen of data, "that resistance changes nothing. Species like yours always attempt it. It always fails. It simply delays the inevitable and adds unnecessary discomfort." "And if we don't resist?" Ethan asked. "Then the transition is efficient," Vesic said. "Efficient is better for everyone. Ethan wanted to argue, but he had learned in his very first week of training that arguing with power rarely worked, and arguing with power that could erase a coastline worked even less. Instead, he watched. He listened, and slowly, he began collecting the small, strange details that nobody else seemed to notice. The council fleet arriving in orbit was smaller than expected. Vesik's staff complained, quietly, about delayed supply shipments. A council engineer once muttered something about the corridor being unstable, before catching himself and changing the subject entirely. Twice, Ethan overheard officers asking each other if anyone had heard from a nearby outpost, and both times, the question was answered with silence rather than data. He started keeping a private notebook, the old paper kind, because paper could not be scanned as easily as a tablet. He wrote down every strange comment, every uneasy glance between council officers, every delay that nobody could explain. Meanwhile, on the ground, humanity was not simply lying down. In basements and old military bunkers, in universities and abandoned factories, people who refused to accept the broadcast as final were beginning to organize. They called themselves nothing grand, nothing dramatic. Most groups simply called themselves the line, because they intended to be the line the council would not cross without a cost. One of these groups was led by a former engineer named Noah Bennett, a broad-shouldered man with a quiet, steady voice, who had spent the last 2 days studying every piece of footage of council technology he could find. He did not believe in charging at ships with rifles. He believed information was the only weapon humanity currently had that the council could not simply confiscate. Noah's small team began mapping council patrol routes, listening to intercepted communications, and most importantly, watching the skies. Not for attacks, for patterns, because Noah had noticed something too, something that matched, without either man knowing it yet, the very same suspicion forming in Ethan's private notebook. Council supply ships were not arriving on schedule. At first it seemed minor. A transport delayed by half a day, a patrol ship that took a strange, roundabout path to reach orbit instead of the direct route council vessels always used. But delays turned into missed arrivals, and missed arrivals turned into entire schedules abandoned without explanation. Ethan noticed the change in Vesik first. The administrator's usual bored calm began to fray at the edges. He snapped at his staff more often. He spent long hours reviewing navigation logs that used to take him minutes to check. "Is everything all right?" Ethan asked one evening, more out of professional caution than genuine concern. Vesik studied him for a long moment, longer than he had ever studied Ethan before. "Human," he said finally, "how much do you know about how our ships travel between stars?" "Almost nothing," Ethan admitted honestly. "Good," Vesik said, in a tone that was not comforting at all. "Keep it that way." That night, Ethan wrote in his notebook a single line that would matter more than he could yet imagine. "Something is wrong with their ships. Something they don't want us to know about." He had no idea, not yet, that the same wrongness reaching through the council fleet was about to reach into every corner of the galaxy at once, and that Earth, small, unimportant, recently claimed Earth, sat at the very center of it. Outside, under a sky now crowded with alien lights that did not belong there, the first cracks were already forming in a conquest that had seemed, only days earlier, absolutely unstoppable. Ethan closed his notebook, looked up at those unfamiliar lights, and felt, for the first time since the broadcast began, something other than fear. He felt the smallest, most dangerous thing a conquered person can feel. He felt hope. 3 weeks after the council fleet arrived, the first checkpoint went up less than a mile from Ethan's childhood home, and he learned about it from a stranger's shaking voice on the radio before Vesik ever mentioned it to him directly. The occupation had stopped being a broadcast and had become a routine. Council shuttles now landed daily in cities across the world, scanning buildings, cataloging mineral deposits, tagging forests and rivers with small floating markers that hummed quietly and glowed a pale green. Humans who once ran newspapers now ran translation booths for council officials. Farmers who once sold their harvest at local markets now filled out forms explaining why a percentage of every crop belonged, by treaty, to a species that had never once said please. Ethan spent his days inside the administrative post, watching the machinery of occupation grind forward with a horrifying, boring efficiency. It was the boredom that scared him most. Nobody screamed, nobody threatened. Paperwork replaced violence, and paperwork was much harder to fight. But underneath that calm surface, the cracks he had noticed weeks earlier were widening. Vesik's fleet was shrinking, not because of any resistance, but because ships kept vanishing from the schedule. A cruiser, due to rotate in from a nearby system, simply never arrived. A cargo hauler carrying replacement parts sent one confused message about the corridor closing behind us before communication dropped entirely. Officers whispered about a phenomenon that had no official name yet, something several crews had begun calling, half joking and half terrified, the silence. Ethan first heard the phrase from a young council technician named Doran, who was younger than most of the officers and less careful about what he said in front of a human he assumed did not matter enough to listen closely. "My cousin's ship went dark near the outer relay," Doran muttered to another technician over a shared meal, unaware Ethan understood every word. Not attacked, not damaged, just stuck. Engines fine, jump drive dead, like something reached into the ship and turned it off. "The silence again," the other technician said, lowering his voice even further. "Command says it's a mechanical fault," Doran said. "But 3 ships in 2 weeks? That's not a fault, that's a pattern." Ethan wrote every word down that night, hands trembling slightly with the same fragile hope he had felt weeks earlier. He began comparing dates, comparing locations, comparing which ships had failed and where. A shape started to form in his notebook, faint but undeniable. Every failure had happened closer to Earth than the last. Meanwhile, Noah Bennett's group, still calling themselves simply the Line, had grown from a handful of engineers into nearly 40 people scattered across 3 underground shelters. They were careful, disciplined, and quiet, refusing any action that could provoke the kind of retaliation the Council was fully capable of delivering. Instead, they listened, they mapped, they waited. Noah's closest partner in the effort was a sharp, quick-thinking woman named Emma Wright, a former air traffic controller who understood flight patterns better than almost anyone else in the group. It was Emma who first noticed, independently of Ethan, and weeks before either of them compared notes, that Council patrol ships above their region had begun taking longer and longer to complete routine orbits, as if their engines were straining against something invisible. "They're slowing down," Emma told Noah one night, spreading printed satellite images across a table lit by a single lantern. "Not because we're doing anything. Something is wrong with their ships. Maybe it's a trick," Noah said cautiously. "Maybe they want us to think they're weak so we make a mistake." "Maybe," Emma admitted, "but if it's real, it's the biggest opportunity we'll ever get." The 2 decisions, made independently in 2 very different rooms, both pointed toward the same unfolding truth. On one side of the occupation, a quiet liaison officer filled his private notebook with patterns pulled from overheard conversations. On the other side, a resistance engineer filled a folder with patterns pulled from patrol footage. Neither man knew the other existed yet, but both were converging on the same terrifying, thrilling possibility. The Council's ability to leave Earth was failing. The pressure inside the administrative post grew heavier by the day. Vesik, once calm to the point of coldness, began holding longer meetings behind closed doors, his voice rising in frustration, in ways Ethan had never witnessed before. Twice, Ethan was ordered out of rooms without explanation. Once, he saw an entire team of engineers working through the night on something they refused to discuss with any human staff, their expressions tight with something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. Then came the night everything shifted from suspicion into undeniable fact. An alarm sounded across the entire administrative post, different from anything Ethan had heard before, a deep, pulsing tone that made even the Council officers flinch. Screens throughout the building lit up with a single message repeated in a dozen alien scripts. Ethan could not read most of them, but he recognized enough symbols from his training to understand the shape of the sentence. Jump capability lost. Entire sector affected. Awaiting further instruction. Vesik emerged from his office, looking, for the first time since Ethan had met him, genuinely shaken. He did not order Ethan away. He did not seem to notice Ethan at all. He simply stared at the screen as if it had personally betrayed him. "It's not isolated anymore," Vesic said quietly, almost to himself. "It's spreading." "What is?" Ethan asked carefully. Vesic turned to him slowly, his shimmering skin dimmer than usual, his voice stripped of its usual bored authority. "Every ship capable of long-distance travel within 3 sectors has lost the ability to jump. Ours included. We are no longer simply administrating this planet, human." He paused, and for the first time, something like real fear crept into his tone. "We may be stranded here." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. Stranded meant the fleet above Earth could not call reinforcements. Stranded meant no new ships, no new weapons, no new officials arriving to replace the ones already here. Stranded meant, for the first time since the broadcast had claimed his planet as property, that the balance of power might actually be shifting. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He understood too well how dangerous a trapped predator could become. But inside his chest, something tightened with a feeling he had almost forgotten how to recognize. Possibility. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan slipped out of the administrative post under the excuse of checking a communication relay, a task he had performed a dozen times before without suspicion. Instead, he walked toward the tree line at the edge of the compound, toward the coordinates a contact had once mentioned in passing, a name he had filed away without understanding its importance. The line. He found them exactly where the whispers said they would be, in an old maintenance tunnel beneath a decommissioned radio tower. Noah Bennett greeted him with more suspicion than welcome, a rifle slung casually but visibly across his shoulder, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "You're the translator from the administrative post," Noah said. It was not a question. "I am," Ethan admitted. "And I think you already know something is wrong with their ships." Noah's expression didn't change, but Emma Wright, standing just behind him, leaned forward slightly. "Why would you tell us that?" she asked. "You work for them." "I work close to them," Ethan corrected. "That's different." And tonight, their entire fleet lost the ability to jump. All of it, not just here, across 3 sectors. Silence spread through the tunnel, heavy and electric. "You're certain," Noah said finally. "I heard it from the administrator himself," Ethan said. He wasn't lying, he wasn't performing, he looked afraid. Emma exchanged a look with Noah, a silent conversation built from weeks of shared suspicion finally confirmed. "If they can't jump," she said slowly, "then they can't call for backup. They can't retreat. They can't resupply. They're trapped with us," Noah said, the words heavy with meaning. Ethan nodded. "Which means for the first time since this began, we might actually have a choice in what happens next." Nobody in that tunnel celebrated. Nobody cheered. The reality of what they faced was still enormous, still uncertain, still deeply dangerous. A wounded predator could lash out before it accepted defeat, and the Council still commanded technology far beyond anything humanity possessed. But something had changed in the room, something unspoken yet unmistakable. For the first time since alien ships had darkened Earth's sky, the people gathered in that tunnel began to believe that survival was not simply about enduring the occupation. It was about outlasting it. Above them, unseen in the darkness, the Council fleet hung motionless in orbit, its jump drives silent, its officers afraid, its grip on Earth beginning, ever so slightly, to loosen. And far below the surface, in a hidden tunnel lit by a single lantern, 3 people who had never met until that night began quietly planning what to do with a chance that nobody, not even the Council itself, had ever expected to appear. The days after the Council fleet lost its jump capability moved differently than any days Ethan had experienced before, stretched tight with a tension that never fully released. Above Earth, the fleet remained in orbit, unmoving, unable to leave, unable to call for help. Below, on the surface, the occupation continued exactly as before, checkpoints, scanners, forms, quotas, as if nothing at all had changed. Vesic had ordered strict silence on the matter, terrified that news of the fleet's vulnerability might reach human ears and inspire exactly the kind of resistance he had spent weeks assuring his superiors would never succeed. He was already too late. It had already reached human ears. It had already inspired exactly that. Ethan continued his work inside the administrative post, translating routine reports by day, meeting Noah and Emma in the tunnel by night. Trust between them grew slowly, carefully, built on small verified truths rather than blind hope. Ethan brought them information. Noah and Emma brought him patterns from the ground that confirmed what the council refused to admit publicly. The jump failures were not slowing down. They were accelerating. Emma had begun tracking every reported failure using old aviation software repurposed for the task, plotting each incident on a physical map spread across the tunnel wall. Red pins marked ships that had lost jump capability near Earth's system. Blue pins marked failures reported by intercepted council communications from farther away, in neighboring systems the humans had never even known existed until weeks earlier. "Look at this," Emma said one night, tracing a finger across the map. The failures started small, scattered, almost random. But now look at the shape they're making. Ethan studied the pattern, and his stomach tightened. The pins were not random anymore. They formed a slowly expanding circle, and at the exact center of that circle sat a single point. Earth. "It's radiating outward," Ethan said quietly. "From here." Noah leaned over the map, his jaw tight. "You're saying our planet is causing this?" "I'm saying it's possible," Ethan said. "And if it's true, the council doesn't know why yet." Vesic looked genuinely lost tonight. His engineers have been running diagnostics for days without finding a mechanical cause. They're starting to consider explanations that have nothing to do with engineering. "Like what?" Emma asked. "Like something about this planet itself," Ethan said. The idea felt too large to hold on to, too strange to be true, yet too consistent with the evidence to dismiss. That same week, Ethan reached out quietly to someone he had once trusted long before the council ever arrived, a retired physicist named Henry Collins who had spent decades studying anomalies in Earth's magnetic field that mainstream science had never fully explained. Henry lived alone in a small house near the coast, far from any checkpoint, surrounded by decades of research nobody outside academic circles had ever taken seriously. When Ethan arrived, cautious and unannounced, Henry did not seem surprised at all. "I wondered when someone would finally ask me about the readings," Henry said, ushering him inside without hesitation. "What readings?" Ethan asked. Henry gestured toward an old desk, covered in printed charts, his hands steady despite his age. "For the last 30 years, instruments buried deep in research stations around the world have picked up strange pulses from far beneath the crust. Most scientists dismissed it as noise, interference, equipment error. I never believed that. The pulses were too regular, too structured to be random." "Structured how?" Ethan asked. "Like a heartbeat," Henry said simply. "Slow, deep, and until recently, almost undetectable. Until recently." Henry pulled a newer chart from beneath the others, the lines sharper, more pronounced than the faded ones beneath it. "Since the council began drilling into the crust for resource extraction 3 weeks ago, the pulses have grown stronger, much stronger, and they correlate almost perfectly with the timeline of these jump failures you're describing." The room went quiet, except for the soft hum of old equipment. Ethan felt the weight of the theory settle over him like a physical thing. "You're saying the council caused this," he said slowly, "by drilling into something they didn't understand." "I'm saying it's possible the planet has always carried this property, dormant, unnoticed, harmless until now," Henry said, "and that whatever they've disturbed beneath the surface is emitting something that interferes with the very technology they use to arrive here." "A defense," Ethan murmured. "Or simply a consequence," Henry said. "Nature doesn't choose sides, it reacts." Ethan returned to the tunnel that night carrying Henry's charts, and the reaction among Noah and Emma's group was immediate and electric. If true, it meant the council's own greed, their own careless extraction of Earth's resources, had triggered the very phenomenon now trapping them on the planet they had claimed as property. But knowledge without direction was dangerous, and the group understood that better than anyone. If council leadership discovered this theory before humanity controlled how it was revealed, the most extreme factions among the occupiers might respond with catastrophic force, blaming Earth for sabotage rather than accepting responsibility for their own actions. "We need to be careful how this gets out," Noah said, staring at the map now covered in new notes. "If they think we did this on purpose, they'll retaliate before they ever consider negotiating. And if we hide it," Emma added, "eventually they'll discover it themselves, and they'll wonder why we never said anything." Ethan understood the danger from both directions immediately, trapped between two disastrous outcomes: reveal too soon, without proof, and risk blame; reveal too late, and risk suspicion of deliberate concealment. The tension inside the administrative post was rising in parallel. Vesic grew increasingly desperate, holding meetings that stretched through entire nights, demanding solutions from engineers who had none to offer. A faction within the council fleet, led by a rigid, uncompromising commander named Draxis, began pushing for immediate, forceful control over the human population, arguing that if the fleet could not leave, it must at least secure absolute dominance over the planet it remained trapped upon. Ethan overheard fragments of this argument during a tense meeting he was ordered to translate, and the words chilled him more than anything he had heard since the occupation began. "If we cannot leave," Draxis argued, his voice sharp through the translation feed, "then we cannot risk instability. The human population must be fully subdued, resources secured, resistance eliminated before they realize the extent of our vulnerability." "They may already realize it," another officer said cautiously. "Then we act before they organize," Draxis said. "Better a controlled population than a chaotic one." Vesic, for reasons Ethan did not fully understand, hesitated. "A crackdown of that scale would require resources we do not currently have the ships to enforce," he said carefully, "and it would guarantee the very resistance you claim to fear." Draxis was not swayed. "Then we take what we need before that resistance forms." The meeting ended without resolution, but Ethan understood, with sudden and terrifying clarity, that time was running out for a peaceful path forward. If Draxis gained enough support, the Council's response to their own vulnerability might not be caution. It might be violence. That night, Ethan met Noah and Emma with urgency he had not shown before. "There's a faction inside the fleet pushing for a full crackdown," he told them. "They want to secure control before we can organize. If they act first, negotiation may never be possible." Noah's expression hardened. "Then we need proof of the cause behind their jump failures, and we need it before Draxis convinces the rest of his command to act." "Proof isn't enough," Emma said. "We need someone willing to listen on their side too. Someone who isn't already committed to Draxis's plan." All eyes turned, unspoken, toward the one connection they already had inside the administrative post. Vesic. Ethan felt the weight of what they were suggesting settle heavily on his shoulders. Approaching Vesic with this theory meant trusting an alien administrator who represented the very power that had claimed his planet as property. It meant risking everything on the hope that fear of being stranded might make Vesic more open to truth than pride would normally allow. But the alternative, waiting silently while Draxis pushed the fleet toward violent control, felt far more dangerous. "I'll talk to him," Ethan said quietly. "Tomorrow." Noah studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then we're betting everything on one conversation." "We already are," Emma said. "The moment their ships stopped jumping, this planet became the most important thing in the galaxy. Everyone's future depends on what happens next." Outside the tunnel, the sky remained crowded with council ships that could no longer leave, their crews growing more anxious by the day, their command divided between fear and force. Beneath the surface, in a hidden room lit by borrowed light, three people who had never expected to become the deciding voices of a planetary crisis prepared for a conversation that could either prevent disaster or ignite it completely. Ethan barely slept that night, his mind replaying every version of the conversation he would need to have, every way it could go wrong, every way it might, just possibly, go right. Tomorrow, he would walk into Vesic's office not as a translator, but as a messenger carrying the one truth capable of changing everything. Tomorrow, humanity's fate and the Council's fate would begin, for the first time since the broadcast claimed Earth as property, to move in the same direction. Ethan stood outside Vesic's office longer than he intended, rehearsing words that kept rearranging themselves in his mind, no matter how many times he repeated them. When he finally stepped inside, Vesic looked exhausted in a way that no longer resembled the calm, bored administrator Ethan had first met weeks earlier. His shimmering skin had dulled further, and dark shadows seemed to pool beneath his eyes, despite having no true eyelids to close. "You requested this meeting outside official channels," Vesic said, not looking up from a floating screen filled with failed diagnostic reports. "That is unusual for you." "What I need to say is unusual," Ethan replied carefully, "and I believe it's important enough to risk speaking without official permission." Vesic finally looked at him, weariness giving way to something sharper, more attentive. "Speak then." Ethan took a slow breath and laid out everything, the strange pulses recorded for decades beneath Earth's surface, their sudden intensification following the Council's resource extraction, and the near-perfect correlation between that intensification and the timeline of jump failures spreading outward from Earth, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Vesic listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable through most of the explanation. When Ethan finished, silence stretched between them long enough that Ethan feared he had made a terrible mistake. "You believe your planet is causing this," Vesic said finally, his voice quiet. "I believe your extraction operations disturbed something dormant," Ethan said. "Something that has always existed here, but never had reason to react before now." Vesic rose slowly from his seat and moved to the window overlooking the administrative compound, staring out at the crowded, motionless sky. "Do you understand what you are suggesting, human? If true, this means our own operations created the very trap, now holding our entire fleet in place." "I understand," Ethan said, "which is why I came to you, before this reaches Commander Draxis." Vesic turned sharply. "You know of Draxis's intentions?" "I know enough to understand that if he learns this before you decide how to respond, he will likely blame Earth for deliberate sabotage, rather than accept that your own actions triggered it. And I believe that blame will lead to exactly the kind of violent crackdown neither of us wants." For a long moment, Vesic said nothing, his gaze fixed on the fleet hanging useless above the planet he had once considered fully conquered. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its old authority, only a tired, careful honesty. "I did not choose this occupation, Ethan," he said. "I was assigned it, the same way you were assigned your position within it. I have followed council law my entire career, believing, perhaps naively, that law existed to bring order rather than harm." He paused. "If what you say is true, then this occupation has caused a wound neither species intended, and neither species can easily heal alone." "Then help me prevent Draxis from making it worse," Ethan said. Vesic studied him carefully. "And what would you have me do?" "Bring this theory to your full command, before Draxis forces a vote toward violence," Ethan said. "Let them hear it from you, an administrator, rather than discover it later and assume we hid it deliberately." Vesic was quiet for a long moment, weighing a decision that could easily end his career, or worse, depending on how his superiors reacted, to an administrator siding with the very population he had been sent to control. Finally, he nodded once, slowly. "I will bring it forward," he said. "But understand, human, if Draxis dismisses this as fabrication meant to manipulate us, the consequences will fall on you and your people first." "I understand the risk," Ethan said. "I'm asking anyway." That evening, Vesic called an emergency session of Council Command, gathering senior officers from across the fleet into a single secured chamber aboard the flagship still hanging silent above the planet. Ethan was not permitted inside, forced instead to wait in the tunnel with Noah and Emma, the three of them staring at a small radio relay that occasionally caught fragments of the encrypted proceedings. Fragments filtered through, sharp voices arguing, long silences following disputed claims, the unmistakable tension of a command structure fracturing under pressure it had never been designed to withstand. At one point, Draxis's voice rose loud enough to be caught clearly. "You would have us believe a primitive species solved a mystery our own engineers could not? This is manipulation, nothing more, meant to shift blame away from whatever weapon they used against us." Another voice, calmer, responded. "The physicists' data predates our arrival by decades. It cannot be fabricated to serve their interests now." The argument continued, swinging back and forth between suspicion and reluctant acceptance, until finally, the transmission cut to static, the meeting ending without any of them knowing which side had prevailed. Ethan barely slept that night, replaying every possible outcome. If Draxus's faction had won, the crackdown might begin within hours. If Vesik's argument had prevailed, there might, for the first time, be a path toward something other than conquest. The answer arrived the following morning, not through Vesik, but through an unexpected visitor who approached the tunnel entrance directly, escorted cautiously by two of Noah's watchers who had spotted the figure moving alone across the open field above. It was Vesik himself, without guards, without ceremony, standing at the entrance of a human resistance shelter he had never been meant to find. "I came alone," Vesik said quickly, seeing the tension ripple through the group at his sudden appearance. Draxus has been removed from command authority for the moment, though his supporters remain numerous. Command has agreed, reluctantly, to consider a different path, but they require proof beyond a single physicist's charts, and they require it quickly, before Draxus regains enough support to force another vote. "What kind of proof?" Ethan asked. "Direct measurement," Vesik said. "A joint expedition to the extraction site itself, human and council engineers working together to confirm the source of the disturbance and determine whether it can be stabilized or whether it will continue expanding indefinitely." Noah's expression tightened with suspicion. "You're asking us to walk your engineers directly into the heart of what caused this. I am asking for cooperation neither of our species has attempted before," Vesik said. "Because the alternative, continued suspicion, and eventual conflict, benefits no one. My fleet cannot leave. Your planet cannot easily remove us by force. We are, whether either side wishes it or not, bound to the same fate until this is resolved." Emma studied him carefully. "And if the expedition proves your engineers caused this deliberately, through the drilling, then Draxus's faction loses whatever justification it still holds for aggression," Vesik said, "and responsibility falls where it belongs." The decision was not easy. Trusting council engineers with access to the extraction site risked exposing far more than data. It risked exposing the very people and locations the resistance had worked so hard to protect. But refusing risked losing the only opportunity to shift the balance of command away from Draxus's faction before violence became inevitable. After a long, tense discussion, Noah finally nodded. "A joint expedition, limited access. Our people accompany yours the entire time." Vesik agreed without hesitation, relief visible even through his alien features. 3 days later, a small expedition assembled at the edge of the largest extraction site on the continent, a massive scar carved into the earth, where council drilling equipment had bored deep into the crust, in search of resources the treaty claimed belonged to them. Henry Collins arrived with his decades of instruments. Emma coordinated logistics with quiet precision, and Ethan stood beside Vesik as translator and witness, watching as human and alien engineers worked side by side, for the first time since the broadcast had claimed the planet as property. The readings, once gathered, confirmed everything Henry's decades-old charts had suggested. Deep beneath the crust, an ancient structure, neither fully natural nor fully artificial, pulsed with an energy the Council's own instruments had never encountered before. The drilling had disturbed a dormant balance, awakening something that now radiated outward, disrupting the very jump technology the Council depended upon. Whether the structure was a natural phenomenon unique to Earth, or the remnant of something built long before humanity existed, none of the instruments could say for certain. But the cause was undeniable, and the responsibility for triggering it belonged entirely to the extraction operation the Council itself had ordered. When the results reached Council command, Draxus's argument collapsed entirely. There was no sabotage, no manipulation, no primitive weapon turned against them. There was only consequence, the price of greed acting without understanding, and a fleet now forced to accept the reality of its own making. Standing at the edge of the massive scar in the earth, watching human and alien engineers quietly packing away shared equipment, Ethan felt the shift happen, subtle but unmistakable. For the first time since the broadcast had claimed his planet, the future no longer felt entirely decided by someone else. It felt cautiously, dangerously, like something both species might finally have to build together. With Draxus's authority broken, and the true cause of the jump failures confirmed, the Council occupation of Earth entered a strange, uneasy phase that nobody, human or alien, had fully prepared for. Vesic, now carrying more influence within the fractured command structure than he ever had before the crisis began, moved quickly to formalize what had started as a single desperate expedition into something resembling genuine cooperation. But formal agreements between an occupying fleet and a resistance movement did not appear easily, and trust, once broken by conquest, did not rebuild overnight simply because both sides shared the same trap. Draxus, though stripped of command authority, still commanded loyalty among a portion of the fleet, particularly officers who viewed any cooperation with humanity as a humiliating retreat from the Council's original claim. Rumors spread quickly through both the administrative post and the tunnels beneath the surface that Draxus was quietly gathering support for a final, desperate attempt to seize full control before any lasting agreement could be reached. Ethan felt the tension every day inside the administrative post, watching officers who once followed orders without question now exchanging uncertain glances, unsure which authority truly commanded their loyalty. Vesic moved carefully, aware that any misstep could reignite the very conflict the discovery at the extraction site had barely avoided. Beneath the surface, Noah and Emma faced their own version of the same uncertainty. Not every human resistance cell agreed to trust an alien administrator who had, only weeks earlier, been enforcing the very occupation they had sworn to resist. Some argued that cooperation was surrender wearing a gentler mask. Others, more pragmatic, argued that survival required accepting an uncomfortable truth. Humanity did not yet possess the power to force the Council fleet to leave, and the fleet, trapped and vulnerable, needed human knowledge of the planet to survive its own crisis. The debate came to a head during a tense gathering inside the largest resistance shelter, where representatives from cells across the region met to decide whether to support the fragile cooperation Ethan, Noah, Emma, and Vesic had built. A grim-faced woman named Charlotte Bell, leader of a cell from the northern region, voiced the doubts many shared. They claimed our planet as property without asking. Now that their own mistake trapped them here, we're supposed to simply help them recover? Why should we trust anything they promise once they no longer need us? Noah, standing at the front of the gathering, did not dismiss the concern. I don't trust them blindly, he said. I trust the situation. Their fleet cannot leave. They cannot resupply. They cannot easily force us into submission without risking total collapse of their own operations here. For the first time since this began, our cooperation actually matters to them, not because they respect us, but because they need us. And when that need ends, Charlotte pressed, when they find a way to fix their ships and leave, or worse, bring in reinforcements through some method we don't understand? Ethan stepped forward, choosing his words carefully. That's exactly why any agreement we make now needs to protect us beyond this crisis. Not just cooperation to solve their immediate problem, but a framework that limits their claim over this planet permanently, backed by their own admission of responsibility for what happened here. The room fell quiet, considering the weight of what he suggested, not simply surviving the crisis, but using it to renegotiate the very terms of the original conquest. After hours of difficult debate, the resistance cells reached a fragile consensus. They would continue cooperating with Vesic's faction, but only in exchange for a formal renegotiation of the Council's claim over Earth, one that recognized human sovereignty rather than treating the planet as unclaimed property to be catalogued and extracted at will. Carrying this demand back to Vesic was its own dangerous task, an administrator already walking a thin line between cooperation and rebellion within his own ranks now needed to convince a fractured Council command to abandon the very treaty that had justified their arrival in the first place. Vesic listened to the demand with visible tension, aware of exactly how difficult it would be to sell such a concession to officers still loyal to Draxus's view of galactic law. The Council does not simply abandon claims, he said slowly. Such a decision would require approval far beyond my authority, from a governing body that has not yet even received word of what has happened here. Then send word, Ethan said. Tell them the truth. Tell them their own operation triggered a phenomenon capable of stranding fleets across multiple systems, and that the only reason their people remain safe on this planet at all is because the population they claimed as property chose cooperation over retaliation. Vesic studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his alien eyes. You understand that message could just as easily be read as a threat rather than an offer. It's both, Ethan said honestly, and I think your command needs to understand that clearly. The message was sent through the last functioning long-range communication relay still capable of transmitting beyond the affected zone, a slow, fragile connection that would take days to reach any council authority capable of responding. During those days, the situation on the ground remained tense, fragile, balanced on a knife's edge between fragile cooperation and renewed conflict. Draxis, sensing his influence slipping further with each passing day of peaceful cooperation, made one final attempt to seize control, rallying a small but heavily armed faction of loyal officers in an effort to forcibly remove Vesic from command and reassert full council dominance over the planet before any renegotiation could be finalized. Word of the attempted takeover reached Ethan through a frightened council technician who slipped a message to him under the guise of routine translation work. Ethan rushed to warn Noah and Emma, and within hours, the resistance network mobilized alongside Vesic's remaining loyal officers in a tense, careful operation to intercept Draxis's faction before they could act. The confrontation, when it came, was not the violent battle either species had feared throughout the entire occupation. Faced with a unified resistance from both human fighters and council officers loyal to Vesic, and with no realistic path to reinforcements or escape, Draxis's remaining supporters found themselves isolated, outnumbered, and without any viable strategy beyond surrender. Draxis himself was removed from command entirely, his authority stripped by the very fleet he had once expected to command through fear alone. With the final threat of internal conflict resolved, the fragile cooperation between humanity and the stranded council fleet finally had the space it needed to grow into something more permanent. Weeks later, a response finally arrived from council authority far beyond Earth's system, delayed by the very jump failures that had started the entire crisis, forcing the message to travel through slower, conventional means across a route that took considerably longer than any communication the council had ever relied upon before. The response did not grant everything the resistance had demanded, but it granted enough. The original claim over Earth was suspended, pending a full review of the circumstances surrounding the planet's unique phenomenon, a review that would require years of careful, cooperative study between human and council scientists to fully understand. Until that review concluded, Earth would be recognized as a protected research zone rather than claimed property, with human governance restored over its own population and resources, while council personnel remained present, no longer as conquerors, but as stranded researchers, working alongside the very species they had once intended to control. Ethan stood beside Vesic on the day the announcement was finally made public, watching crowds gather cautiously around the grounded flagship, once a symbol of unstoppable conquest, now slowly being repurposed into a shared research station where human and council scientists would study the very phenomenon that had changed everything. "It is not the ending my superiors would have chosen," Vesic admitted quietly, watching the crowd below with an expression Ethan had never quite seen on him before, something close to relief. "But it is, perhaps, the only ending that allows both our peoples to survive what happened here." "It's not really an ending," Ethan said. "It's a beginning, a strange one, but a beginning." Noah and Emma joined them a short while later, watching the same crowd gather below, human and alien engineers moving side by side through the wreckage of what had once been an occupation, now slowly transforming into something neither species had ever expected to build together. "We didn't win this through force," Noah said, watching the scene unfold. "We won it because they needed us as much as we needed answers." Maybe that's the only kind of victory that actually lasts, Emma added. Ethan looked up at the crowded sky, still filled with council ships that could not yet leave, their crews slowly adjusting to a future none of them had planned for. Somewhere beneath the earth, the strange pulse that had started everything continued its slow, steady rhythm, no longer a mystery to fear, but a phenomenon both species had committed to understanding together. Earth had been claimed as property once, stripped of its voice, treated as nothing more than an entry in a distant ledger. But the very forces meant to secure that claim had instead exposed its fragility, forcing conqueror and conquered alike to accept a truth neither had expected. Some things could not simply be claimed. Some things had to be earned, understood, and shared. And as the grounded flagship began its slow transformation into a symbol of uneasy partnership rather than domination, Ethan Brooks understood that the story of that claim, and everything it had cost both species to undo, was only the first chapter of a much longer, far more uncertain future still waiting to be written.